Also, you're going to notice within the clothings, the focus on geometric patterns. Geometric patterns is something that's going to be culturally diffused from Islamic influence as well. So as the Islamic influence passes through trade and conquest, you'll remember that the Muslims were iconoclastic. They didn't really depict religious figures. Instead, they focused on calligraphy as well as patterns. Okay, so that's going to be something that's continued in Africa as a result of that influence from Islam. Okay, now for this slide, this is talking about Islam's impact on trade. Now, we said earlier that impact is another word for what? Effect. Good. So this probably means that we're looking at causation. So merchants in Islam arrive via the Sahara Desert and the Indian Ocean. Now, did they just happen along Africa on those routes? No, they were engaging in trade, which led to cultural diffusion. And that trade led to a lot of wealth as well as the diffusion of religion, specifically Islam. So if we're looking at causes and effects, what brought Islam into Africa? Trade. What allowed Africa to become wealthy? Trade. Okay, so those are causes. Now, if I gave y'all the prompt of to what extent, and what does to what extent mean? What are we asking for here? We're not at a historical thinking skill, but we're asking how much exactly. So how much? To what extent did Christianity and Islam spread in Africa? Okay, so how much did Christianity spread? A lot or a little? A little. So we would say to a lesser extent. What about Islam? A lot, to a great extent. So we've said how much did they spread? Islam a lot, Christianity a little. Now we need to address the question of how. How did Christianity and Islam spread? Well, our initial answer is going to be through trade, specifically through these routes, the Sahara and the Indian Ocean, but also how else does cultural diffusion happen? Through conquest. So the Umayyad dynasty, as they move through northern Africa to get to Europe, okay, through their conquest, they're going to spread Islam. So if we were going to write an essay on this prompt, to what extent did Christianity and Islam spread in Africa, you would say Christianity and Islam spread in Africa through trade and conquest. However, Islam spread to a greater extent than Christianity, as evidenced by how the majority of Africa was Islamic, whereas only Ethiopia was a stronghold of Christianity. There's a thesis right there. Does that make sense? Okay, remember the Bantu material is all context. And we had talked about the extent to which Christianity had spread in Africa, and we know that that extent was not very great. Christianity spread to a lesser extent compared to Islam. Now, what spread Islam in Africa? In addition to the conquest of the Umayyad dynasty as they moved across northern Africa, you also have the cultural diffusion of Islam through trade, primarily through trade routes. You have the Saharan Desert and the Indian Ocean. Okay, the Saharan Desert and the Indian Ocean. Now, what made the Saharan Desert trade possible? That would be the cultural diffusion of camels. Now, does anyone remember the last thing that we covered on this slide? Did we just begin it?
I've got notes like up until this slide, but we don't have any notes on this slide yet.
Okay, so we've just started this slide then. All right, so when we talk about the Saharan Desert, we're talking about an arid desert. What does arid mean? Dry. Okay, so farming is impossible. You cannot grow crops in a desert. So if you're going to support your economy and you can't support it using agriculture or even pastoralism, because how many cattle or sheep can you raise in a desert? Not a lot, because they need grass and food just like humans do. So it's impossible to farm. It's nearly impossible to raise animals in the desert. And so instead, their economy is going to have to pivot to trade. And so there's going to be nomadic trade. Nomadic just means that they move a lot. So they're not settled in one area. They don't claim an area of the desert and say, this is where we're going to put our house. Okay. They move along trade routes. And so, like the Silk Road in China, which is a series of routes that go from city to city trading luxury goods, you're also going to have the Sand Road in the Saharan Desert. So the Silk Road, it's named that because of its luxury goods. The Sand Road is named that for obvious reasons. It's in a desert. Now, what made this route possible? Well, that is all due to camels. Now, where did camels come from? Where did they culturally diffuse from? The Middle East. Good. So from Saudi Arabia. So we get camels from the Middle East and they culturally diffuse through trade. Now, why are camels so much better than horses and donkeys? Well, they're going to replace horses and donkeys because camels can go 10 days without water. Okay, 10 days without water. And that is super, super beneficial. They store water in their humps. So y'all probably know that camels have either one or two humps. The purpose of that is that it stores all of that water. So if you can go 10 days without water, that means one, more water that is reserved for the humans, the merchants who are trading on that route. And then two, you don't have to make as many stops. If you have to cross across a large expanse of desert that has no oasis, it has no water along the way, then you could possibly make it because you get almost 2 weeks of travel without water. Then once you do stop to fill up when you get water, a camel can drink 50 gallons in 3 minutes. So it is super fast. You don't even have to stop for very long because they are chugging that water. So that is hugely beneficial when it comes to trans-Saharan trade. Now, camels is one of your vocabulary terms on your ID list, as well as one of the terms that you can use in your bingo project. So when it asks you to define camels, okay, it also asks you for historical significance. What was historically significant about camels in this unit? They made trade across the Saharan Desert possible. Okay, excellent. I got that in the private chat. So if you're writing about historical significance in your bingo project, that would be the historical significance for camels. Now, when we talk about trade, we're talking about two parts. We're talking about exports and imports. Exports are what you sell. Okay, imports are what you buy. So, what were the African empires and kingdoms selling in the Saharan Desert? Well, their biggest commodity was gold. A commodity is something you can buy and sell. Okay, so their biggest commodity was gold. They had very, very rich gold fields, especially near the Empire of Mali in the west. They're also going to sell ivory, which we know comes from animals. So, ivory comes from the tusks of rhinoceri and elephants. Did y'all know that early pianos, their keys were made out of ivory from these animals? Now the ivory trade is banned because of the cruelty to animals. You have to kill the animal in order to saw off its tusk. And so that's now outlawed. But back then, it was a thriving trade. It was a luxury good. Okay? So much like we see with the Silk Road with porcelain and silk, you have other luxury goods coming out of Africa. Also, they're going to be exporting slaves. Now, early on in history, prior to the year 1000, the biggest source of slaves wasn't Africa. The biggest source of slaves was Eastern Europe. Okay, so when you think the Byzantine Empire and the Kievan Rus empires, remember that every fall, the Kievan Rus would round up peasants. Okay, they would gather up peasants and then they would take them down to Constantinople to sell as slaves. So that was the primary source of slaves up until this point. But eventually, especially when we get into period two, we're going to see that shift over into Africa being the prime source for slaves. But this is a different type of slavery than what we're used to hearing about with New World slavery. So there's Old World slavery, which is prior to 1492. Now, what happened in 1492 that led to a new type of slavery? What big event happened in 1492 that changed the world? The discovery
New
of the
World.
Americas, exactly right. And so the Europeans are going to have a very, very high demand for slave labor. Okay, so they're going to exploit slave labor for that. Now, in Old World slavery, the people that could become slaves was very broad. It could be prisoners of war, POWs. So if you defeat someone in battle, especially like with the Aztecs, for instance, if you defeat an empire or a kingdom in battle, you can claim the soldiers that you defeated as prisoners of war. And so they would be slaves. Debtors could be slaves. So if you owed money, you could sell yourself or your children into a temporary form of slavery until your debt was paid off. Witches. Okay, witches could be punished by being forced to be slaves. And then criminals could also be punished by being slaves for a certain period or time. But this type of slavery in the old world was not always permanent. It could just be for a number of years or until you paid off your debt. It was not hereditary. So if a slave had a child, that doesn't mean that their slave status was passed out down to their child. Their child was born free in the old world slavery before 1492. And it was not racial. Old world slavery was just based on your socioeconomic status. Were you a criminal? Were you a debtor? Were you a peasant who had been caught in the Kievan Rus roundups in the fall? But we're going to see that that changes after 1492. So that's a change over time. Where after 1492, the Europeans are going to institute what's called transatlantic slavery or the Asiento. It's supposed to be an S. And that's going to change to being permanent, hereditary, and based on race. And it's also going to be incredibly deadly. Okay, the life expectancy for a slave is approximately 2 years after they're captured. Okay, so extreme brutality and extreme levels of death occurring under New World slavery. So at this point in period one, which is before 1492, we're talking about Old World slavery. Not as deadly, not permanent, not based on race. Okay, still bad, okay, but just different. When you're comparing different types of forced labor, you can't make an opinion-based argument of this one was better or this one was worse. That is not an argument you can make. They're all bad, okay? But you can compare and contrast characteristics of that forced labor. For instance, if I were to compare slavery to serfdom, both of those systems use forced labor, but what's a key difference between the two?
Forced labor can be forced upon just regular citizens who've done nothing wrong.
Wait, what was that last part?
Forced labor can be put on citizens who have no like criminal record or anything like that, just for the sake of the government saying you have to do it.
Okay, so in terms of the government, in terms of who's in charge, that could be the vassals. All right, so if a vassal wants a serf to work for them, can they buy the serf? Can they buy that person? Oh, I see in the chat. Someone said that the serf is tied to the land. So in serfdom, you don't buy people, you buy land, and the people who are on the land come with it. So serfdom is not the purchase of humans, but in slavery, you buy the person. Okay, is Africa exporting land? No, they're exporting slaves. Is the Kievan Rus exporting land to the Byzantine Empire? No, they're exporting slaves. So a key difference between slavery and serfdom is what they are selling. Slavery sells people. Serfdom, while it is still forced labor, sells land. It's just that the serfs are tied to the land. Does that make sense? All right, so that's what Africa is primarily exporting. What are they importing? What are they buying? Well, they're primarily buying things like salt, textiles, which is just like clothing or cloth, and beasts of burden, like horses or camels. Now, why is salt so valuable during this time period?
That was the only way you could preserve food.
Yeah, it can preserve food, particularly meat. So it is very, very popular for supporting a population by preserving food. Are we good on this slide? Okay. All right. Here we are showing the expansion from the Empire of Ghana, which is in this area in red. So where you see this area, that's the Kingdom of Ghana around the year 1000. Remember that the year 1000 is approximately when we start seeing centralized rule in Africa. So moving from kinship based networks to actual hierarchies with a king or an emperor at the top, and then a noble class. Okay, and then you just go down that stratification of society, that levels of society. And eventually you're going to get the kingdom of Mali once Sundiata takes over and establishes his empire. So what I want you to note on this map is that both of these empires are going to have centers of trade and centers of education. Jenny is a center of trade, as well as in this area around here, you have the capital of Ghana, known as Kumbai Saleh. It's supposed to be an E. So this capital of Ghana had buildings of stone. Why were there buildings made of stone instead of, say, lumber?
Because there weren't many trees around.
There weren't many trees around. They are below the Saharan desert. They live in the Sahel, which is a savanna. It is made up of grasslands, not a lot of trees in those grasslands. And so they have to adapt to their environment, cause and effect, to stone buildings. In addition to buildings made of stone, they're also going to have mosques. What does that tell us?
Religious cultural diffusion.
Yeah, religious cultural diffusion. Of what religion?
Islam.
Islam. Okay, that it came through the Saharan trade routes from the Middle East. And here you see in blue, these are the trade routes that we're talking about that crisscross across this desert. You're also going to find that they form a large army based on taxes. All right, and so what are they taxing? They are taxing trade. Taxing trade is known as tariffs. Okay, so if those people from the Arabian desert, if those merchants want to come and trade in Kumbai Saleh, when they get to the gates, they're going to be charged a tax. If you want to come in here and sell your goods, first you have to pay the empire. So you can have the right to buy and sell goods in this area. So this is going to make them very wealthy. Now we know that expansion is expensive. Okay, so the money from that trade, that extreme wealth that we get from the Saharan desert routes as well as the gold mines in Mali is going to help them expand. So eventually, as you see the rise of the Mali kingdom, it expands out of this area in red to go along the western coast of Africa, as well as further into Central Africa. And the main cities, the cities of learning and trade in the Mali Empire, are going to be Timbuktu and Gao. So, just like when we talked about in the Umayyad Empire, you have Damascus as a capital of trade and learning. You have in the Abbasid Empire, Baghdad is a capital of trade and learning. In Byzantine Empire, what's their capital of trade and learning? Constantinople. Excellent. So you have the same exact thing going on in Africa at the exact same time. Remember, everyone is going through a golden age during this time, except for who?
Europe.
Europe. Okay. The Europeans are not having a golden age. They don't have capitals of learning and trade and education, with the exception of Spain, but only because it's under the Islamic rule of the Al Andalus, with their capital in Cordoba. Cordoba. So everybody is going through a golden age except for Western Europe. They're going through a dark age. Okay. And that includes Africa in that golden age. Are we good so far? Okay. Now that we've talked about the Saharan Desert route, what's the other trade route that's important for Africa? The Indian Ocean. Good. So looking at Indian Ocean trade, we're going to find that this Indian Ocean trade is going to have the effect, okay, cause and effect, of revitalizing trade along this eastern coast. All right, revitalizing means bringing back to life. So this is going to bring considerable wealth to East Africa. Okay, remember, north is here, south is here, west is to the left, and east is to the right. So we've talked about Western Africa with Mali. Now we're talking about Eastern Africa. And these city-states that emerge along this coast in reaction to or as an effect of this Indian Ocean trade are going to be called the Swahili city-states. Now remember, Swahili is a language. It's a syncretic language. It's the combination of what? What two languages combine to make Swahili?
It was the Arabic language from the Quran and the Bantu language from the tribes.
Good. The Bantu language, which is native to Africa, that spread through that migration of the Bantu people, and the Arabic language, which came from over here in the Middle East. Okay, so they combine together to make something new, which we know is syncretism. Okay, so these thriving city states are going to thrive. They're going to make a lot of money, not really so much based on agriculture, but based on trade. Now, they are going to have agriculture, but they are going to supplement their agriculture, their farming, and the crops that they're able to grow to support their population with ocean fishing and maritime trade. Okay, so this Indian Ocean route is critically important to the survival and the success of this coast, this eastern coast. Now, one of those important city-states that emerges on this coast is the Kilwa city-state. And this important city-state is going to have aspects of civilization like multi-story stone buildings. So that just means they have more than one floor. And again, stone buildings is evidence of them adapting to their environment because they don't have a lot of wood. So what are they going to build their infrastructure out of? Usually stone. So multi-story stone buildings, as well as copper currency. Remember, currency is just a form of money. In addition to that, like we said before, we also have cowrie shells as a form of currency. So we have all of the major signs of civilization. We have trade, we have government, we have infrastructure, we have currency, we have farming. All right, all of this is indicating that they're going through a period of civilization and that it leads into their golden age. Now, also along this coast, known as the Zanj coast, you're going to be exporting and importing the following. Okay, remember, exports means you are selling. So what are they selling? They are selling gold because they have very rich gold fields, not just in the west over here, but also in the east. Ivory and slaves, like we said before, tortoise shells, which is just, big turtle, peacock feathers, and rhino horns, which also goes with ivory, but rhino horns were also used in traditional medicines. Okay, so it's used for medicinal purposes. Not sure that actually helped, but just throw it in there. Also, for imports, what are they buying? Well, if they're in contact with states in the Indian Ocean, that means that they're definitely going to be in contact with India. Okay, so they have access to India. And what is India going to be exporting during this time? Cotton and textiles, because cotton is used to make clothing. And textiles is just another word for clothing. So they're going to be importing cotton and clothing from India. They're also going to have access to China through the Indian Ocean route, as well as through the Silk Road as merchants travel to India on the Silk Road. So what are they going to get from China? More luxury goods like porcelain. And then, of course, you also have the importation of iron technology, which is going to be good for farming as well as for weaponry. Does that make sense? So if you make a claim in an SAQ or an essay where you say Africa imported luxury goods, you're going to have to be specific. They imported luxury goods like porcelain from China through the Indian Ocean trade routes. And maybe you can even throw in monsoon winds. You could say that due to the monsoon winds, merchants had to time their travels according to those winds. And as a result, they stayed for extended periods in this coast, establishing families and thereby culturally diffusing their religion by having their wives and their children follow Islam. Does that make sense? Because the major faith that merchants are going to follow isn't going to be Hinduism, it isn't going to be Buddhism, it isn't going to be Christianity, it's going to be Islam. That's the one that primarily spreads through trade, and you have to give examples of that. All right, so now that we've talked about the two trade routes, we're going to compare and contrast Eastern Africa, which is right here in this coast along the Indian Ocean, and Western Africa, which is over here by the Saharan Desert. Okay,